Hi, I'm Carys and Odanga.
And I'm Odanga Madung, and you're listening to the Over the Top Under the Radar podcast.
We take a look at the stories in the news that are being overreported and those flying under the radar and not being talked about enough. My co-host this week is Odanga Madung. He's a Kenyan data journalist and researcher and a former colleague and current friend. Hi, Odanga. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Carys. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here for the first time, which I hope will be the first of many. So, yeah.
So tell me about your over the top for the week.
I think my over the top for the week is what I'd like to call the great exodus of influencers from the Middle East.
So for people who aren't familiar with this story, explain what's happening.
Yes, I mean, the Iran war happens. One of the interesting bits about the exodus that happens from the Middle East is this very large outflow of not just normal people, but influencers. And, one of the things that's interesting about it is that for the longest time, there are very many countries within the Middle East that have tried to focus on getting creators and influencers and other types of, digital content producers into their territories in order to sort of recast their image.
Like a sort of weird tourist initiative, isn't it? Like getting Western influencers.
They call it influencer washing, actually. It's actually called influencer washing, where, and they basically were tasked with this sort of, how would I call it? Sort of job. Their job to be done was basically to recast, the UAE and several other countries in the Gulf as this paradise. And I think Dubai is actually perhaps the biggest example of what that looks like. But very, very quickly, these people in this time and point have come to understand that that all rules apply equally. All is fair in love and war. Yeah, and in this specific case, in the section of war, they suddenly have learned what the values of democracy are, and so they're getting like arrested for recording like Instagram videos, right? And getting detained.
So a lot of this, there's been a lot of coverage of this in the UK because a lot of the influencers are British, and it's basically they've gone over to be like, come to Dubai, it's amazing, like shopping, paradise, and then they've started to try and report on the war because obviously they are being impacted because a number of nations in the Gulf have been under attack from Iran. And so, I mean, is it true that they've been blocked from banning content or they've been like told off for posting about the war?
Some have been arrested. If I'm not wrong, some have even been detained. And the thing is, it's funny. I don't know. I know people would like to say influencers are people too, but personally, I found it to be incredibly funny how, they largely left their home countries to come to a country that, basically they performed migration for the sake of work, right? And a lot of them
economic migrants.
They were economic migrants, yeah. And when the time came for them to flee, they underwent the same rights abuses that very many people across the world go through. And so, I think for many of them, I would like to say, many of them don't consider themselves to be political beings, right? But as I've always told people, if you don't do politics is gonna do you, honey. And it is doing influencers quite a bit.
It is a powerful example of that. And especially, I think, I know you're gonna get into this, but I think also for people who are like living a bit of a privileged life in the countries that they are based in. And like, as you say, there's a sort of, we would probably say, this idea of like migrants versus expats, right? They get to be expats, but it turns out when the war hits. But there was something else about the story you think you think the influences are being covered too much. What's the other component of the story?
I think for me, what's interesting is that that very notion that when these people come to these countries, they are considered to be expats, but they live within the same ecosystem as people that are called migrants, right? Well, guess what happens when there's all of you are likely to be considered the same, right? And the sheer fact that they mostly ignored a lot of the rights abuses that were happening around them, right? Has now actually, the chickens have come home to roost. The same authoritarian tendencies that have allowed migrant workers to be exploited within the Gulf are now basically extending themselves into their plush lives, right? And that bubble is basically getting popped. And so I think for me, that's one of the things that we say, that I think is very important when you think about rights-based work, which is that, it's either we fight for all of us, right? Or we fight for none of us. I think there's something you always said about like nothing about us without us. Like that, just that idea that you can't just assume that you can live in a bubble, right? And ignore the plight of your neighbor. Yeah, those same things that are being used against your neighbor are gonna be used to come after you. And that's been a consistent theme that I've seen, especially in a lot of conflict that has been going on this year. That is always something that is going to be transferable.
And I think it's a really good over the top because it's like, and we can get into this, you're a journalist too. It's like, on the one hand, there's always an interest in something when it's happening to, this is really true in the UK, when it's happening to British people or Westerners, it's suddenly more interesting news. And you see that a lot, especially in the UK media, that, a national disaster can happen, a natural disaster can happen, there can be a tsunami, and the reporter will always be like, and how many British people are there? Like, it can be like, well, thousands of people in like an Asian country have died, but like, are any of them British? And I feel like this sort of focusing in on the influencers is a microcosm of that, right? It's like, well, what about the white people who are just, trying to post their content? And you're right. I think it's something like 80% of the workforce in the United Arab Emirates are migrant workers. And most of those are Black and brown people from like India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, working in like pretty terrible conditions. And I would guess, and I think the limited reporting we've seen suggests that they are obviously the ones being worst affected by the bombing and the unrest caused by the war in Iran. So yeah, I think it's a really good over the top of like, it's probably a nicer picture story to have like a sort of blonde Dubai influencer in a bikini, but they are by and large probably not the people who are being worst affected by the war in Iran.
Well, I can't blame them because I like the absurdity of the story. Yeah. I like the absurdity of the story. It feels a lot like an idiocracy movie, where, World War III is happening and, the people that are the best positions to document it are a bunch of gym bros and gym bros and baby girls, right? And I'm just like, wow, some of them became very serious journalists, yeah, which was
Did they?
very
I
funny.
haven't seen much of
Ah,
that.
man, I followed that stuff like to the T. Like, especially before like the Arabs we started taking it down. It was the most amazing thing. Because they were getting like missiles, like when the missiles were hitting like the Burj Khalifa, like they're very clear indicators of it all. And then suddenly, like the government comes in and clamps down, and they're like, "Thank God the government is keeping us safe." And they all had like this one script about it, which I found to be very, very
So we had this
interesting.
like brief moment of citizen journalism where like the influencers were showing what was going on, and then suddenly it was back to the like, everything in Dubai is amazing, I love it here.
It was top notch. It was top notch citizen journalism that was coming from these guys. I kid you not. I kid you
Okay, so
not.
maybe we need maybe actually this is a trend that we need to encourage, like get the influencers to be getting more political.
I no, I do believe that. Okay, look, I mean, hey, there's a place for like I think they need to be aware of the bubbles that they were in. It's very clear
Mm.
that they weren't. And I think to me, what I find to be interesting is how yes, the influencers were an amazing story, but I think the true story of what is happening with the migrants and the migrants within these countries is what I'm actually very concerned with. Because for the longest time, and I think it's interesting, especially given the news that has come out of the UN about the whole aspect of describing slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, as the greatest crime to humanity, right? I think in a time where we want to talk about slavery, I think this is one of the interesting microcosms in which we are able to observe the effect of that.
And what you're referring to is the United Nations just passed a resolution that describes the transatlantic slave trade as the greatest crime against humanity. So that was like, it was passed by a majority, but a lot of countries abstained or opposed the vote.
It was three countries. It was the US, it was Israel, and Argentina.
They opposed it. Yeah. They
Yeah.
were against it, and then the UK abstained, which is a sort of
Interesting.
coward's way out. But
Mm.
123 nations voted in favor of this idea that the slave trade was the gravest crime against humanity. And I guess what you're referring to is like there is modern slavery going on in places
And
like Dubai.
And modern slavery is such an important thing to talk about, because you'll be shocked at the number of people that are actually participating in modern slavery without knowing about it. And the thing about, especially when you consider the war currently that's going on within the Middle East, is that there are very many cases whereby people have been abandoned because chances are, if bombings have happened and people have had to flee, chances are that your master has actually gone away with your passport. What then happens is that we're beginning to see that it is very likely that human trafficking is at an all-time high, because one of the things nobody's actually talking about is you see a lot of the women that go ahead to go and become maids within the Gulf, right? Those women still want to go. So if I had a conversation with the airport workers here, and they were saying that the terminals to the Middle East still have people who are still filled with women who are keen to fly into the Middle East to go and seek out jobs. They don't care if World War III is happening within that part of the world. They're still
Mm,
focused on, they're so desperate about their current situation at home that they're still willing to go, number one. Number two, there are people who are stuck in the Middle East who are basically stateless because their passports have disappeared and need to come back home.
mm,
Who exactly comes in to fill in that problem? Human traffickers.
mm,
Yeah, so one of the things is that nobody's actually paying attention to is the state of human trafficking between East Africa and perhaps other parts of Asia and going into the Gulf. That is actually likely to be undergoing a very serious boom in light of the cancellation of flights and all of that kind of stuff. Huh? And so I feel like, yes, focusing on influencers was fun, but there is a story about some truly helpless people in this war that nobody's actually thinking about, nobody's talking about, and nobody's paying attention to. And I feel like they're the ones who are the true story of what is going on with the geopolitics of this and how it inevitably always ends up affecting Black and brown people.
You are listening to this show completely ad-free thanks to our Patreon community. What does that mean? We don't run any ads on this show. Instead, we ask people who listen and can afford to contribute a small amount every month to help cover our production costs and keep us running. There are just under 400 Patreon supporters, and we need 500 for the show to be sustainable. So if you can afford to support us, please sign up today. It really makes a difference. Every penny matters. Go to patreon.com/over the top under the radar, and you can join us for as little as £3 each month. When you become a Patreon supporter, you get a bonus episode of the show every single week. You get a behind the scenes newsletter every single week, and you get the chance to submit questions to our guests and shape the bonus content. You also get to join the Over Under WhatsApp community, where the conversation keeps going in between shows. Patreon.com/over the top under the radar. So my over the top is the Louis Theroux Netflix documentary about the Manosphere. So I'm going to give you and anyone listening who hasn't seen the documentary a summary. So basically, Louis Theroux is historically been a documentary maker who works with the BBC, and he's British. He's got a particular style. So he's quite famous in the UK for his style of documentary. He's done, he's interviewed loads of famous people. He does a lot of sort of exposés. He does this thing. I mean, I'm not a huge Louis Theroux fan, although I think for some people he's like a national treasure. But he used to do a show called Weird Weekends. He's made documentaries about Michael Jackson, neo-Nazis, Scientologists. So he often will go undercover with extreme people or maybe celebrities. And his thing is kind of exposing people, getting them to admit things maybe they haven't before, maybe getting them to cry. So basically he's well known in the UK for a certain style of documentary. So his first ever Netflix documentary was about the Manosphere. It came out, I think, in the last few weeks. It's been one of the top viewed shows on Netflix. And there's been a lot of debate about whether he went too easy on the people in the Manosphere, whether he focused on the right things or not. And I guess the reason I think it's over the top is I think we have this obsession with the Manosphere. We've had it for a few years. I think that what happens whenever one of these documentaries comes out is that you get loads of focus on the specific people that are interviewed. So, like, we've had a real obsession with Andrew Tate for years, or Joe Rogan. So, like, this documentary follows I think he follows like 3 or 4 people. One who's a British guy based in Marbella. You get a couple of American guys. And basically, he follows these guys around. He meets their partners. He meets one of their mums. And it's like an hour and a half documentary looking at what they're saying and also looking at, whether childhood trauma is the reason that they have these views. And I guess for me, I do think it's important to talk about the manosphere. I do think it's important to report on the manosphere, and I'd love to hear about your perspective on it. But I do think that when you focus in on the individuals and shocking things that they've said, you're sort of missing the structural point. One of the things that isn't talked a lot about when we're talking about the Louis Theroux documentary, or even in the documentary, is these people are being incentivized to say this stuff. Like, one of the guys that he interviews is really clear. He's like, I don't care what I say if it gets clicks and makes me money. Because Louis Theroux, so one of the things that he shows is a lot of these manosphere influencers, like, they'll do content with women who have OnlyFans pages. So loads of them will, like, this one British guy, I think he's called HS Tiki Toki is his handle. He has a big house in Marbella, and he'll get like hot blonde women who've got OnlyFans pages over to make content. And the OnlyFans women are promoting themselves. He's promoting himself on his live streams, and he gets views and clicks. And Louis Theroux tries to be like, well, is this consistent with your beliefs? You say that you want to marry a virgin. You say you don't think women should be sleeping with people. So why are you doing work with OnlyFans people? And like, he's pretty clear. This guy is pretty clear. He's like, it makes me money. It performs. It gets clicks. And he's like, I'm not presenting myself as someone who's ideologically coherent. I'm presenting myself as someone who's successful and wants to make money. And I actually think that really hits on something that is quite key to understanding the manosphere. Rather than anthropologizing these men and the people that follow them, maybe we should be looking at the financial incentives. Like, the truth is, saying extreme things like this on the internet gets you clicks, gets you ads, gets you money. And so, yeah, I think that's the thing that gets missed in this, like, was Louis Theroux too easy on them? Did he miss the point? But I'd be interested in your perspective, because there's the Kenyan manosphere is pretty big, right?
I wish he had the chance to come to Kenya and actually interview the Kenyan Manosphere leaders here, because I have done extensive coverage about the Manosphere for a very long time. I will share maybe a link with you that maybe you
Yeah, we'll
can
put them
put
in the
up.
show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, about that, for a story that I did for CNN about it. And one of the things that nobody talks about is the fact that Kenya has the third largest manosphere in the English speaking world. Yeah.
Wow. So who's
Yes,
the
it
top two?
does.
America and UK,
And
or?
the UK, yeah. So right after America and the UK, you have Kenya. Kenya has the third largest manosphere in the English speaking world. Yeah. And so it's something that I think many people gets lost on many people in terms of the fact that this is a phenomenon that is going way, way beyond what many people might think is happening within the US and the UK. I wonder how much it speaks to perhaps a commonality of issues across the three countries. I don't know what those commonalities might be, given how different the contexts are. But, when I look at the manosphere, I do agree with a lot of, or rather with your sentiments in terms of trying to understand the structural incentives that allow people to engage with the manosphere in itself. And that I think the audience of disenfranchised young men is always going to be something that is extremely profitable to capitalism. It's not the first time, and to be honest, if we think about it in a longitudinal sense, this is not the first time that someone has made money off of disenfranchised young men, right? You've had Axe, you've had Philip Morris, you've got alcohol companies, right? Like, this has always just been a very fruitful market for a lot of people. And I think it's just that now, in terms of the market of ideas, we're having a case whereby people have actually been able to find a very exploitative way of trying to manipulate a lot of these young people. Now, for me, it's just one thing that is worth considering is you cannot underestimate the massive size of the manosphere. Andrew Tate was one of the most Googled people in the world, I think, 2 to 3 years ago. And that just speaks to how expansive his media footprint was before platforms decided to take a number of actions in order to take down his reach. But as you can see, His reach even had some form of political influence when you look at his influence on people like Baron Trump, who then go ahead and, who then goes ahead to help him get released. I think is it from Romania, right? So yeah, it's you can't underestimate there. Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, you can fact check me on that, but I do know that, part of a large part of their influence and how they were able to steer young men towards the White House was, yeah, it is said that Barron Trump and a lot of the people within Trump circles are big fans of his. So
So in
yeah.
one of the guys that Louis interviews in his Netflix documentary is, it lives in Miami, talks a lot about going to Mar-a-Lago, having dinner with the Trumps, having dinner with Barron Trump. So you're right, there is a really clear tie to the MAGA movement. I think there's an interesting point you made about disenfranchised young men. Like I think the other thing is when you focus in on these one or two figureheads for something that is huge and systemic and structural, then you sort of end up being like, well, let's get rid of Andrew Tate's whatever Instagram account. I mean, one of the people that Louis interviews is someone who has been banned from lots of platforms, but he still has teenage boys coming up to him on the street because obviously there are still clips. Like he lost his account on TikTok, but TikTok content about him is like being clipped and going viral. So I think you're right. Focusing in on those one or two people means that you're not actually dealing with the bigger ecosystem of people who are all connected and boosting each other. And it's not like a couple of bad apples, right? It's not like a couple of men that have offensive views. As you say, it's like something being marketed and sold to men. I mean, one interesting thing in the Netflix documentary is looking at these sort of weird investment opportunities that a
Mm.
lot of those, like basically all the ways that people monetize their followings, whether it like, and is that the case in Kenya as well?
So if I can just chime in on this, and this is very important, this whole idea of taking down the biggest actors within an extremist ecosystem, because that's what it is. And a lot of the time, especially when I've been doing my coverage of the manosphere, 90% of the time, the literature that I've actually borrowed from in order to be able to understand what's going on is reading extremist literature, like trying to understand, like what comes from this side that is mirrored onto this side. And,
Mm,
it's just about coming to a reckoning about how much technology companies have created the best types of engines of radicalization. Yeah. The
mm,
capacity for you to go down a rabbit hole is something that I think is incredibly dangerous. And that's where perhaps I might disagree with people that might have said that Louis Theroux might have gone too soft on the people who he interviewed, because if I was to think about it from my own research, if you speak to someone who has found themselves going down the rabbit hole or within the manosphere, they do not start off by actually trying to get these types of radical views. These are just normal disenfranchised young men that are seeking out answers in the world. And the first place that they will try to seek out those answers is through the internet, right? And so they will start off by saying, I can't get a girlfriend. Okay. Why doesn't she like me? He's been rejected or something like that, right? And has never had a chance to be able to take and tackle that kind of rejection. Or he's broke and he's like, I want to get rich. Yeah. Or, yeah, or he wants to get buff. And look at the positioning of all manosphere influencers. They're either pickup artists or they are, what is it called? Hustle culture bros. Yeah.
yeah, or
Or
gym
that,
bros.
or gym bros. Right? Basically, the entire Dubai influencer ecosystem.
It all comes back to the Dubai influencers.
It always starts like the Dubai influencer ecosystem, right? And they're all just trying to figure out how to be men. They're really, really just
Mm,
trying to understand. And I do wonder, because of course Kenya has, and maybe also the one other thing, maybe I wonder if the three countries, Kenya, the UK, and the US share maybe might be a chronic presence of fatherlessness, right? A chronic epidemic of fatherlessness, right? Where you've
mm,
got a huge number of people that are growing up in the absence of male father figures, right? I wonder if that is also one of the things, because
mm.
Kenya has a very well documented
I
um,
didn't know that.
yeah, Kenya has a very well documented fatherlessness problem. Huh? And so, that maybe absence of those people, mentors that people can look to is affecting where people end up seeking answers about what it takes to be a man. Yeah. So, I think that then lends itself to very much the engines of radicalization that I'm talking about. But I think it's very important also sometimes especially when we think about, because this is extremism, yeah? When we think about such kinds of things, sometimes, yes, a level of compassion is needed that perhaps would be able to let you into that world that, the very hard-nosed accountability mechanism might not be able to. Right. But that's just me coming in from my experience about learning how to work around these things. But of course, that's not to say that they deserve the compassion, right?
No, I think
So,
it, well,
yeah.
no, I think it is an important point because at this point, so many of these views are so prevalent that, and as you say, they're extreme views that have become increasingly mainstream. So I don't know that it's helpful to just demonize people because then you're demonizing like huge chunks of the population. So yeah, you're right. I think a bit of compassion. I guess the other thing to say, and it kind of connects to my under the radar, is these beliefs have existed for a long time. Like, you know, believing that men and women are different, that men have to behave a certain way, women have to behave a certain way. I mean, the thing that is in the Netflix documentary is this idea of like one-sided monogamy, where like the guy can have lots of partners, but his girlfriend or wife can't. But like these aren't new ideas, right? They're sort of tale as old as time. What is new is that there are these social media platforms that thrive on extreme content. And as you referred to rabbit holes, that like, because they're obsessed with all of us staring at our phones or our screens for as long as possible, the thing that helps us to do that is extreme content. So like these people are being platformed and almost encouraged to be more extreme because the extreme stuff performs well. People look at it. One of the guys in the documentary is like, has this thing where he sort of beats up pedophiles. So, I mean, how we know that these people are pedophiles or not, but he'll like pretend to be a young girl, arrange to meet a guy. The guy turns up and he's like, you're a pedophile, and beats him up. Like that probably performs really well. Beating people up performs really well. It's good content. He puts it online. So yeah, I think you're right. Having a compassion and having a structural view is important. So my under the radar for this week are the two big court cases that have just found against Meta. This hasn't gone completely under the radar. There has been some coverage. There are two court cases this week that have come back. One in New Mexico that was looking at Meta and child sexual abuse, and the one that has just come back in Los Angeles. The jury has just come back with a verdict looking at Meta and YouTube. So both of these verdicts are found against big tech. So the first one was against Meta. It was actually against lots of companies, but most of them settled. That was a $375 million settlement. And this new settlement against Meta and YouTube found that their products were addictive to young people and harmed young people. So I think this has flown under the radar because the only way we're going to get accountability for big tech firms is if the country where most of them are based, America, manages to get its house in order. And up until now, aside from the fact these firms are huge, they're incredibly wealthy, they spend millions and millions of dollars on lobbying each year. You and I know from our former professional life, it is very hard to hold these companies accountable, even though they are doing a number of incredibly like shady and inappropriate and harmful things. And I think we have to really pay attention to these court cases because in a political system like America that is like gridlocked, finds it very hard to pass new legislation. There's a lot of corporate capture. The courts are probably the best way to start to rein in big tech. And I think both of the verdicts this week are incredibly important because because they are setting a precedent for a way to rein in Meta and YouTube and hopefully their counterparts. I do want to say like the settlement amounts, the 375 million, the $6 million, like these are nothing. They're a drop in the bucket. Meta is $1 trillion company. But yeah, I think it's really important, really interesting. And I wanted to talk to you about it because we've done lots of work on platform accountability over the years. So like, what's your thought on the court cases? What's your thought generally on like the sort of pushback against social media companies?
I'm still in shock, right? To think that that case has actually come to pass. I would have never thought that an addiction case is actually the one that would be able to bring big tech to its knees because, first of all, even proof is hard, right? Like,
Yeah, so it's really interesting because the first case, the sexual abuse case, I think is like almost not easier. None of this stuff is
yeah,
easy,
there's so many
but
easier
it
cases. You
Yeah,
know,
but
this.
so that one, the one with the bigger settlement, it is worth saying this. The one with the bigger settlement, the $375 million one, is actually less landmark because it's basically about child exploitation. And
Mm.
I would say, I don't know what you think, child exploitation and child sexual abuse is the one sort of area where the platforms have to do stuff because grooming children isn't okay. So I think generally there is an example of like YouTube, Meta, others having to put protections in for child sexual abuse and like basically predators being able to use the platform. But I think the really interesting case is the addictive one because that gets to the heart of the business model. And that says like what you are making is harmful. So yeah, for me, I think you're right. It's kind of landmark that the jury have found, and they went away for a few minutes and came back straight away with the verdict.
Yeah, I think it's also because it's largely a personal lived experience for a lot of people. In the sense that you before these technologies existed, you genuinely felt like you were just living your life, and then suddenly every single now and then a notification pops up, and you, for some reason, your heart beats. You look at your screen time, you're spending 4 to 5 hours a week on your phone, with largely most of them being like most of them being around social media apps, and it largely coming to define the majority of the internet experience for a lot of people. It is a very interesting case. Now the thing is, I there are a few voices I'll be keen to hear once they come out. Jonathan Haidt being one of them, because of the amount of work he's done around teen mental health, teen mental illness, and the rise of smartphone use across the world, which I think is something that we would definitely need to watch. And I know he would be happy as hell about what is coming out. But then there's also the implications with regards to, and there's a lot of pushback because there's a lot of meta-analysis that has been done about research papers that have come out, looking into addiction, social media addiction, and some of them have found the correlate, like a lot of the results to be spurious and don't hold up to scrutiny, right?
Mm,
Now, of course, the key question is who funded those meta-analysis of those research papers. But um, it's the thing about 90% of these things is that they're a lived experience. It's not. I don't think it's impossible for anybody to come out and say that they don't feel like, in some form or way, that they're addicted to a lot of these applications. And we know for a fact that they have used gambling design methods in order to be able to design how 90% of the applications are created, right?
exactly. So many designs that we know, and working with psychologists, even the red dot, right? I think you're the same as me.
Mm.
You have notifications turned off on your phone, right?
Yep, I don't have them
Yeah.
on. Exactly.
But even like the red dot is engineered because red is the color of like danger, urgency, to make people feel like a new text message or WhatsApp ping is important and to give your brain that little dopamine hit. So yeah, you're right. Every part of these devices and platforms is engineered to keep us paying attention. And you're right. It's weird to have that lived experience in reality where we all know the impact of these platforms on our lives, but then live in a world where there are no political consequences for that. Up until now, there are really no legal accountability. And like one of the reasons for that we should mention is in the United States, there's something called Section 230, which is a provision which was passed in the 90s. It's like a provision of the American legal system that companies like Meta, Google, so platforms, they aren't responsible for the content on their platforms. So like Section 230, and there isn't really an equivalent in a lot of other countries, basically says what is posted on Meta is not the responsibility of Meta. And that for a long time has held back any ability to hold these companies to account. And hopefully these like verdicts will begin to chip away at that. But yeah, you're right. It's weird to live with the reality of knowing what these phones do, what these platforms do, but then still live in a system where we can't get the companies to behave differently or even like pay some of the costs of all of this harm.
And I need to say this in the sense that there was a time these apps were amazing. Yeah.
Was
Let's
there?
not
Weren't they
lie.
always
Think
evil? Weren't they
about it.
always
Like,
evil?
like, think about it. There was a time, like, I keep telling people, just remember the time when you would scroll on Facebook or scroll on Twitter, and like it would end. Yeah, it would say that's all for the day. Like there's some even had messages at the bottom, like that's all for today. Come back another time, or maybe you'd have to refresh, right? And then Infinite
Before
Scroll
Infinite
came.
Scroll.
Yeah, before Infinite Scroll, like it used to be a very normal thing to finish, right? And I think to me, and there was a time when feeds were not necessarily algorithmic and driven by engagement. Feeds were just I joined Facebook to follow my friends, and
Yeah.
therefore, and therefore I'm there largely to see that and not get all this other content that I'm not subscribed for into the platform.
Yeah, you're right.
They were not as driven by notifications as much as they used to. And so I'm just like, in general, I've always said that, the true philosophy of America is junk food. And when you look at what American tech companies have been able to do to our information ecosystems, is that they have been able to turn our information ecosystems into junk food. And that's
Mm,
largely what it is. Add salt, add fat, yeah,
that's
make
sugar.
it as juicy as possible, add sugar, make it as juicy as possible, and make it as impossible for me to have a nutritious meal as I can. And that's and that is what they have done.
Oh gosh. No, that's a perfect analogy. We should blame the tech companies, and they do deserve a big share of blame. Like, one of these court cases had yet another Meta whistleblower, and like, I don't know, as you say, Meta churns out all these reports claiming that it's not everything it does is fine, but where would we be without all of the staff members that have worked at these companies to blow the whistle? But yeah, I mean, I think we do have to say also, like, part of the problem is this is the profit motive. This is capitalism, like, on steroids, right? If you let technology companies do whatever they want to do in pursuit of money, profit, attention, they are going to do harm. And like, I think that you're right. So much of social media has become junk food, has become, a McDonald's order where you kind of eat and eat and eat, but you're never quite full and you're not getting any nutrition.
It feels the same. I mean, if you have just like three cheeseburgers,
Oh, I
right?
love it. I mean, come on, a Big Mac. So good.
Yeah,
Those
like
fries,
three big, but no, but
salty.
but you know that guilt that you feel at the end,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah. The shame.
It's the same. It's the same as like I. It's the same as spending 2 hours scrolling on TikTok, and you're like, "Damn, what?" Like, there's this emptiness of the soul.
Yeah, but I think it's a good point, because I think a lot of people, when they talk about tech companies, want to compare them to big tobacco. And I actually think you're right. They're much more
Yeah.
like fast food companies or pharmaceutical companies, because
Hmm.
ultimately, I don't believe there is much use to tobacco, right? Like, it's an addictive thing that has no value to us. Like, it's recreational, whatever, but like, nicotine is harmful, cigarettes are harmful, probably vaping is also harmful. Whereas I think the thing about fast food or pharmaceuticals is the product. Like, we need the product, like, we need to
Yeah.
eat, we
There's
need
nutrition.
medicine, we need
Yeah.
social connection. Like, and so, like,
Nutritious
we need
value. Yeah.
information. Yeah, we need information and social connection. I don't want to live in a
Mm-hmm.
world where there is no internet, no social media. But you're right. It's like, you have to regulate these companies, because if we don't regulate them, they're not going to provide nutrition. Like, it's not in their
You just
interest to
eat it.
provide nutrition. They were
Exactly.
like, that's not what makes money. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, we've both worked at this in different professional contexts. It's heartening to see something happening in America, but it is also hard knowing that the only real way to hold these companies accountable is through America, because that's where they're headquartered. I mean, we did some work on the impact of social media platforms in Kenya, but I don't know. I ended up quite pessimistic about how, like, nation states just don't have a lot of power up against, like, the Zuckerbergs of the world. Or do you think there is hope?
I don't know if there is hope. But I do feel like it doesn't mean that people shouldn't try. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I think is important. It does not mean that people shouldn't try. And it's just important that, of course, as people try to do these things within their countries, that they also are doing it within a very rights leaning framework. Yeah. Which is very, very important, because 90% of the time when this comes up, it's because a politician has had a deep fake made of them that they did not like. Right. 90%, I always say that the true motivation for politicians, especially in Africa, to carry out regulation of social media is they don't like it when people laugh at them on social media, right? They don't like all the memes. They don't like the way people talk at them. They've grown up at a point where the people previous to them were gods. And now everybody, is busy making memes about you dancing, and you wake up every morning and you're just like, my God, what is all this that is going on? Yeah. So to me, there's also motives of regulation and all that count. And
Harness
personally,
the
I'm
power of
watching.
embarrassment. Harness the power of
Harness the power of
embarrassment. I
embarrassment.
love that. That's a good
Absolutely.
optimistic note to end on. Okay, so tell me about your under the radar. You've got one about Kenyan politics. What's your under the radar?
I think my under the radar is a very interesting campaign that's being run by the Gen Z of Kenya, but our version of rather our Gen Z here in Kenya to register to vote, which I think is interesting, especially when you consider the increasing evidence that I think, or rather, the evidence that has always existed of social proof and voting behavior, right? The sense that I know you've seen the studies about like how long time ago, like in 2012 in America, when they do the I vote, when Facebook introduced the I voted sticker, and how that was
Mm.
very useful in terms of getting other people to vote and showed a very demonstrable effect on that. And so we're seeing that version, but happening now on TikTok in Kenya, where a lot of young people are like showing off how they're registering to vote with each other, and it's leading to like massive lines of like young kids just running to registration centers. Just of course,
That's
part of it, of
amazing. And
course, is so that they can make content. But I mean, it's an amazing. The means justifies the end, and I'm like, so long as they're registering to vote, it's amazing. I feel like I've learned so much just watching what's been going on in the past 2 weeks as they run about this thing. And yeah, it feels intimidating to be honest, but I think they're doing some really amazing stuff in terms of trying to, bolster each other to register to vote, which is really cool.
so talk to me about what's like, how did it get started? Is there like an organization behind it? Or is it like, was it spontaneous? Are there a couple of influences? Like, how did it come about?
You can't talk about the moment that is going on right now. They're talking about 2024 in Kenya, which is the time when a largely youth-led uprising ended up storming parliament and was subsequently followed by a very vicious state crackdown by the current regime. And at that point, it was very much an unstructured, leaderless type revolt that was mostly pushed by Gen Z using the same methods that they're using now to register, where they actively talked to each other about what the state of taxation is in the country and why they can't get opportunities. And, through a series of protests, really made their voices known to the rest of the country, to the rest of not just the country, I think to the world. And I think for many people are just caught in sheer awe, right? And I think every now and then, I think a country perhaps goes through a golden political generation. In Kenya, unfortunately, it's not millennials. I think,
Oh yeah,
unfortunately, it's not the millennials.
you're a fellow millennial. Yeah. No, it's
you
never
know,
us, is
but
it? It's never
is
us.
I don't think in Kenya it's us. Maybe in America I would say maybe I think they've got some into because I mean Black Lives Matter. Well, what's it called, the Wall Street protests and all of that kind of stuff. I think
Occupy Wall Street. Yeah,
Occupy
that's
Wall Street.
true.
That was the millennials, right? But I think in Kenya, our golden political generation is actually this Gen Z. Since 2024, you have seen a very significant amount of youth-led upheaval happening across the world, right? So after
Mm.
Kenya, Bangladesh follows, then Nepal, then Madagascar. You've got a huge string of youth movements and uprisings happening across the world, all of which seem to be talking to each other. Indonesia goes through its own thing. All of us seem to be talking to each other, and even see the rise of the One Piece man, the One Piece flag being used as like a symbol of international Gen Z solidarity, right? And
I
so,
hadn't seen that. So like the
oh
peace
yeah,
sign. Okay.
yeah, there's a
Oh.
One Piece. The One Piece, the anime, actually, was one of the flags that was being used. Yeah, and it's one of the most interesting things, the most interesting phenomena that within democracy studies that a lot of people have been looking at. And so I think now a lot of people then ask the question, okay, Gen Z, you've made your voices heard. Well, how are you going to tackle politics? Because protests are not necessarily how politics works. So they're like, okay, fine, then you'll register to vote. And this exercise has been very interesting to watch in terms of how they've just been able to convert online action into offline impact. Yeah, which is something a lot of people
Mm.
struggle with in politics. So yeah, and it's very grassroots led. Yeah.
Yeah, I love this as an under the radar because partly because I remember when those protests were happening in 2024, it was like it was heartening, but it was also pretty terrifying to watch how brutally they were repressed. And yeah, just the strength of the crackdown of the Ruto government against those young activists. And I think I really like this story, partly because it's great to see technology being used for used for good, but also because I think it has this broader point about social movements and that, like, you can never fully understand the long-term impact of activism or an uprising until you look at like a 5, 10, sometimes even 20-year stretch, right? So at that moment in 2024, when young people took to the streets and were like, these tax hikes are unreasonable, this government isn't giving us opportunities, like we're going to protest. If you just looked at that 6-month period, then you would have been really depressed because the protests got cracked down on. I mean, I remember you saying a lot of the groups were being infiltrated by state services. But as soon as you zoom out and take a 5-year view, all of those people who were radicalized, all of those people who became leaders have like learned so much and are now channeling that into hopefully some like good. I mean, the next election is 2027, is that right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
if there people can register and turn out, then young people could have a real voice. Okay, that's pretty cool. This is a great under the radar. Do you think part of the reason it doesn't get picked up by journalists is because journalists just aren't on TikTok in the same way?
I don't know why. Okay, I mean, the 2024 protests in Kenya were picked up really big. But I mean, first of all, you have to understand, in a global sense, in a global journalism sense, if you're not doing anything about Iran right now, no editor wants to hear from you, right? If it was a slow global news cycle, absolutely, maybe this is something that will end up on people's radars. But then I think, given the
Mm.
current Iran news cycle, nobody is really paying attention to much beyond that. But I must say one thing, which we cannot ignore, which is that it's very important to consider the fact that the energy, and it's how all these things are connected, right? That the energy shock that this current war is going to cause is likely to lead to a global recession, right? Which is then likely to lead to, again, large swaths of dissatisfaction by a failure of an adequate political response by the elites of various countries, right? The first countries where we are seeing these very serious efforts at rationing, by the way, are very similar to the countries that have actually undergone some serious political upheaval in the last few years. And we are talking about Sri Lanka, right? We're talking about Bangladesh. We're talking like basically the same countries that have undergone some form of upheaval, political upheaval, are likely to go through that. Consider the fact the Philippines, which had protests last year, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Thailand, right? These are countries that have all faced some form of youth-driven upheaval in the past 3 to 4 years. Now, one thing that is very, very important to consider is the fact that what follows a recession, this kind of political upheaval. Consider the fact that the Arab Spring, is largely something that was a butterfly effect of the financial crash of 2008, right? And so,
Okay, interesting.
yeah, so you cannot ignore the fact that, sometimes with some of these things, if someone sneezes, we're likely to catch a cough, right? And sometimes that is going to bring that could come up with some political results in the time since then. Like I keep saying that even the amount of protests we've seen since 2020, you can't ignore the fact that COVID is what warped a lot of people's realities, and that much of them are still about what happened in between 2020 and 2022, right? So.
I mean, COVID is what I was thinking of. Very few governments that were in power during COVID got re-elected. And I guess I wonder that is a potential thing that could happen with Iran. Like there's everyone that's in power now during this global oil shock or shock to oil prices, which will feed through to all other prices for all of us, almost all of us, will that be in the post? But I like the idea that even in the midst of these big global economic and conflict stories, and even in the midst of these big platforms that have power, I love the idea that like a band of Gen Zs are using TikTok to get people to register for votes. I feel like that is a very optimistic note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me, Odanga.
You're welcome.
Where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to find me and my work, you can add me on LinkedIn at Odanga Madung, or you can find me on X as well under the same name. Those are the two mostly platforms where I tend to publish my work, or you might find maybe some of my latest writing on The Guardian or on the Daily Nation here in Kenya. Yeah.
We will link to that in our show notes. Thank you so much, Odanga.